Hi everyone, PV here, and welcome to my new YouTube video. Before we start, I want to talk to you a little bit about my Patreon page. It's totally optional, but if you want to support my work a little bit more and get some extra perks on top of it, you can go to patreon.com/PVDDR. The link will be in the description. Some of the perks that you can get are access to an exclusive Discord server for patrons where I host regular Q&As and post regular updates about what I've been doing in Magic, how I feel about certain tournaments, how they went, whether I like my decks or not, and early access to the videos. So if you're interested in that or just supporting the channel, make sure you check it out. In today's video, we're going to go over what is probably the single most important decision that you can make inside a game of Magic, whether you keep or mulligan your opening hand. A lot of the time, this decision is going to be trivial, right? Because you're going to have a hand that is clearly great or a hand that's clearly bad. No one is going to keep a hand that has no lands or that has all lands, right? So this decision doesn't have to be hard, but sometimes it can be hard and it can be deceiving. For example, what do you do when you have a hand that has the right mix of lands and spells, but they're the wrong spells? Should you keep or should you try your luck with a 7? How about a hand that has all the right cards but only one land? Is it worth gambling on that? So in this video, I'm going to talk about what factors you have to consider to make this decision when it's not obvious. In a general sense, the thing that I found the most helpful towards making this decision is classifying decks in my mind as quality decks and quantity decks. And what's that? Well, quality decks are the ones that have one or two specific cards that are much better than the rest of the deck. Right? The gap between the best cards and the third best cards is very big, and the best cards increase the power of every other card in your deck, which means that a hand with that card is much better than a hand without it. For example, Ores of Auras, right, in Historic. You have Core Spirit Dancer and Shrem, and these are two cards that you need to have and that make every other card in your deck better. So a card like Sentinel's Eyes is horrible by itself, right? But when you're attaching it to Core Spirit Dancer, the card is very good. So a hand with Core Spirit Dancer is worth a lot more than a hand without it. So if you ask me, would you rather have a 7-card hand without Core Spirit Dancer or a 5-card hand with Core Spirit Dancer? Well, the answer is probably the 5-card hand because, that card is worth any number of cards in my deck. When this is the case, you lean towards mulliganing more aggressively, of not settling for mediocre hands because you have this one great card or two great cards that will bail you out from a mulligan to 5 or a mulligan to 6, right? Because you have a card in your deck that is worth many cards. And this is true for example, Simic Oko in the past, Simic Food, because you had Oko, and sometimes you'd mulligan to 5 and you just go goose into Oko, and that was better than a 7-card hand. Historically, we've also had Bitter Blossom decks, fairies, because Bitter Blossom was a card that made every other card in your deck infinitely better. So a 5-card hand with Bitter Blossom was often better than a 7-card hand without it. And because you have this card that bails you out, you can mulligan more aggressively and try to find it. And here, it doesn't mean that you should mulligan every hand that doesn't have your key card, but it does mean that you should be a little bit more demanding from your opening hand. You should raise the bar a little bit on what you're willing to settle for, because you do have the tools in your deck to mulligan and still win the game. So don't settle for mediocrity, right? You know that you can mulligan because these cards are in your deck. And the counterpart for those are the quantity decks. And these are the decks where the cards are relatively similar to each other, and you care more about the quantity of cards that you have than which cards they are. For example, let's take Izzet Phoenix, right, in Historic right now. Even though there is a card that you would like to have in your opening hand more than others, that is Archetype Finish, so you can discard it, it's a deck that often just is limited by the sheer number of spells that it has. So it doesn't care if its spell is a Nopt or a Brainstorm or even a Shock, right? All it wants is that one piece of cardboard, because you need to have, spells to recur Phoenix, and you need to have lands to play, and you just need to churn through your deck, and your spells will eventually find the right cards. So the limiting factor here isn't the quality of your cards, it's the number of them. And this is actually true of a lot of decks playing Fateless Looting, at least, the ones that are playing Fateless Looting in a relatively fair manner. Obviously, if you're playing Dredge, it's not going to apply, but if you have Fateless Looting in your deck and you're trying to play a fair game, or, Brainstorm, these are cards that care a lot about just you having cardboard, right? It doesn't matter what the card does. All that matters is that it's in your hand, so you can discard it or put it back on top and then shuffle it. If you were playing a deck that you would classify as a quantity deck, then you should be more conservative on mulligans, because mulliganing is a lot more punishing to you, because you want cards. You just want a specific amount of cards, the more the merrier, and you don't really care which ones they are, which means that you also don't have a superstar card that bails you out of any situation. So if I'm playing a deck with Brainstorm, Fateless Looting, or a tribal deck, I'm more likely to keep, average hands, or, not mediocre hands, but mediocre hands, right? I'm more likely to keep a hand that I'm not super happy with, because I know that just having, 7 cards in my hand is much better than having 6, and there's no one card that will bail me out from the situation by itself. And here I think it's also worth noting that there are certain decks, especially 1-for-1 attrition-based decks, particularly with discard spells, that turn every matchup into a quantity matchup regardless of how your deck originally operates, because they'll just discard your best cards anyway. So what matters is you have a card left after all is said and done. It doesn't have to be the right card. For example, imagine you're playing against a Jund deck with 4 Thoughtseize and 4 Inquisition of Kozilek. If you're playing against that deck, you can't really mulligan to 5, hoping that your Bitter Blossom in your opening hand is going to bail you out, because chances are this Bitter Blossom is just going to get discarded, then you have a 4-card hand with nothing to make up for that. So when you are playing versus a discard deck specifically, cards like Liliana of the Veil that just, again, care about blank pieces of cardboard, like Kroxa, right? Titan of Death's Hungry. Kroxa is a card like that, because if you have a card to discard to Kroxa, it doesn't matter which card it is. All you need is to have a card. So mulliganing versus these decks is very punishing, and I lean towards keeping worse hands against them just because I want to have, 7 pieces of cardboard to work with. It doesn't really matter what they are. And what about those hands that are, perfect, other than the fact that they only have 1 land, or they're missing the right color of mana, right? You have the perfect 5 red spells, but only 2 black lands, so you can't cast any of your spells. Are these hands worth keeping or not? And that depends on a risk-reward analysis that you're going to have to do on a match-by-match basis. The first thing to take into account when making this decision is how likely you are to get there. So how likely you are to draw the card that you're counting on drawing to make the hand good. For example, going back to that hand with 5 red spells and no red sources, you need to know how many red sources are in your deck, so you know how many chances you have of getting there. Right? And you don't need to know the exact number, because if it's 17 or 18, the math is going to be very similar. Though ideally, you do know the exact number of every source in your deck, right? You should, but you do need to know if it's 10 or 17, because that's a meaningful difference. So once you have this number of how many hits you have in your deck, how do you calculate the likelihood that you hit? Well, if you're not in a match, you can just use a hypergeometric calculator. Right, for example, let's imagine that you have 53 cards left in your deck, and you have 10 red sources. So you just input, 10 successes, and you're trying to draw one on turns 1 or 2. So you have 2 chances of drawing it, and you're looking for 1, and then the calculator will give you a 0.344%, or rather 34.4% chance of hitting that. But in practice, you're never going to be able to do this math exactly during the game. What you can do is make the numbers easier to work with, right? Just round them out, and then you won't get exact calculations, but you will have a rough idea of what's going on. For example, if you have 53 cards left, just use 50 instead, right? Then you have 10 successes in 50 cards, that's 1/5, right? That's an easy math to do, and 1/5 is 20%, which means that the chance you don't hit in the first draw is 80%. Then the chance you don't hit in the first and second draws is 80 times 80, so 64%, which leads to a 36% chance that you hit, which is very close to the 34.4 that we got when using this calculator. It's off because we're working with 50 cards and not 53, and because we don't adjust the second card for the fact that the first card was a miss. So the math does get a little bit more complicated, but you don't need to do the exact math at the table. You just have to have a general idea. So even knowing stuff like, I'm a third to draw it, or I'm 2/3, or half. These are the breakpoints that you're trying to work with when making this math at the table. You don't need exact amounts. And here, it's not only a math problem, because there are a lot of intangibles that you have to consider, and that you just, again, need to evaluate on a case-by-case basis. For example, one important thing that you need to be aware of is how early do you have to hit, right? How much of a disaster is it if you don't hit? Can you win if you don't make your second land drop for 1 turn? How about for 2 turns? Or 3 turns, right? Sometimes you have a hand that is, 2 Thoughtseizes and a dead weight and only 1 land, and then it's a great hand on 2 lands. It's like, well, if I miss for 2 turns, I actually have stuff to play, right? So it pays off to keep a hand like that more often than not, because you're still playing the game even if you miss. Whereas a hand with one land that needs to draw a second land to play anything to begin with is a much riskier thing. Another thing to consider is how likely you are to actually win the game if you hit. Because a lot of the time we look at this type of hand and we think, okay, if I draw one land, if I hit, I'm good. And it's not actually true. For example, you could be playing a Doom Foretold deck and you keep a one-lander because you have a Little Form Blight. And then you think, well, if I hit my second land, I have a cantrip, so that's basically guaranteeing my third land. And that's just not true. You could hit your second land, but not, play your cantrip and not find a third land. Sometimes you keep a hand like that, and the hand doesn't function unless you hit, 3 or 4 lands in a row. And that's just too much. So if you're keeping a hand on the basis of it being a great hand, on the assumption that you draw a land, then you have to make sure it actually is a great hand if you draw one land. You can't need a lot more than that, because otherwise the risk is just not worth it. Right? Because you're taking a big risk here. You're taking the risk of just not being able to play the game, of losing automatically if things go badly. So your reward should be proportional to that. Right? It has to be a very good hand. It can't just be a slightly above average hand, because then it's usually not worth it. And then you also have to consider how likely it is that you win on a mulligan to 6. Because obviously if you have a great matchup, then you're less likely to want to gamble on needing to draw one specific card. For example, imagine you're playing a blue-white deck versus Dredge, and your matchup is hopeless. It's really bad, except that you have one resting piece in your sideboard. Then you see your opening hand, it has one land, you're on the play, because you lost game 1, but it has resting piece. So should you keep or should you mulligan? Well, you should probably keep, because needing to draw a second land is better odds than trying to draw 2 lands and that resting piece again to begin with. So because your matchup is so bad, you're willing to keep a hand that it's not even likely to work, right? It might be under 50% to work, but it's still the best you've got. It's still better than mulliganing and trying to win on 6, because this resting piece is the only way you win the game to begin with, and it's already there. So trying to find just a land, even if unlikely, is better than trying to find a resting piece all over again. Now, imagine you're playing this hypothetical deck with 4 resting piece and 4 Leyline of the Void in it, and you draw the same hand, a resting piece and a one-lander. In this spot, you don't need to keep a hand like this, because you have so many tools in your deck that you can find on a mulligan to 6, right? Any of these cards can win the game on this spot for you, so if you keep a one-lander on the play with a resting piece, you're just giving yourself, a big percentage chance to lose the game for not that much gain. Because if you mulligan, you're very likely to find a hand that has a leyline or has 2 lands and a resting piece. Right? So the contents of your deck and how capable your deck is to win the game on 6 cards is definitely something that you have to factor in. So in the end, it's just a risk-reward calculation that's going to have to be made for each specific situation. Right? You have to consider, how likely am I to hit? How good is it if I hit? How bad is it if I don't hit? And what happens if I mulligan, right? These are the 4 things that you should consider before deciding to keep that one-lander or that hand that, has all the right cards but not the right color of mana and stuff like that. Another thing to consider is whether your hand has what this specific matchup demands. And you're not always going to know what you're playing against, but when you do know, you can be more flexible in your mulligan decisions. For example, if you're playing standard Sultai Ultimatum versus mono red aggro or mono white aggro, and you have a hand that doesn't have any spells to play before turn 4, and you're on the draw. Well, this hand is probably not good enough. It doesn't matter what the spells are. Maybe you have a Shadow's Verdict that's your best card versus mono white, but you're not going to live to cast it. You need to do something earlier on, so you mulligan a hand like that. Whereas if you're playing a different matchup, then maybe you would have the time to develop whatever your good cards are. So knowing the matchup also impacts how you mulligan, especially if you're playing versus a deck that demands that you do something early on. So the speed of your hand is a very important thing when keeping or mulliganing a hand. So you could have a hand that has, a good balance of spells and lands and all the right colors of land and even the best spells in your deck. But if you don't have enough to do early on in these aggressive matchups, you probably have to mulligan. And the opposite is also true, right? If you are playing one of the aggro decks, then you often need to have a faster hand than you have. So you can have the right mix of spells and lands, you can have some good spells, and you still have to mulligan just because you don't have what it takes to win the matchup, and that means just having a fast draw. Now we're going to try to put into practice the concepts that we talked about. So I'm going to give you some sample hands and give you all the context, and you're going to have to decide if you think they're keeps or mulligans. So I'm going to give you some time in the video, but you should pause the video if you want to think longer. And then after that, I'm going to give my explanation on why I think these hands are keeps or not. And here it's important to notice that the specific hand is not the most important thing, because you're not going to get the specific hand ever again, right? What is important is the thought process. What are the things that you should be thinking about with a hand like this? So even if you don't arrive at the exact same conclusion that I do, if your answer is different from mine, what is important is that you think about the right things and make your decision considering the right factors. So our hand number 1 is, you're playing Ores of Auras, you're on the play, it's game 1, and you're playing versus Gru Aggro. Your opening hand is Thoughtseize, Deadweight, Myra's Grasp, Kaya's Ghost Form, Sentinel's Eyes, Consumed Courtier, and Swamp. So think a little bit about it, and we'll be back with my answer. So this hand is about as good a hand as you can get without having one of your 8 creatures in it, right? Because you have the Thoughtseize for turn 1, and then you have 2 removal spells to buy time until you draw your creature. And if you do draw your creature, you already have 2 enchantments for it. So, and you have 2 lands, right? And both colors of mana. So it's basically the best you can get without having a creature in it. And should you keep or should you mulligan? And my answer is mulligan. Because I think this is a deck, specifically, that simply does not work if it doesn't have a creature, right? You don't have a lot of time to draw this creature, because even if you are buying time with removal spells and with Thoughtseize, you don't have card drawing in your deck, and your cards just aren't good outside of these 8 creatures. You're just going to be drawing auras that don't do anything and stuff like that. So my position with this black-white auras deck is that it's absolutely a quality deck, right? It has these 8 cards that are supremely important, and if you don't have one of the 8 cards, you can't keep a hand. It doesn't matter what the hand is, right? So this is super to the extreme, right? In other matchups, you would keep a hand without your flagship card. But in this deck alone, there's no hand that I would keep on 7 cards, not a single one that does not have a creature in it. So I would mulligan this hand, because this deck just needs these creatures to work, and it can afford to, right? Because if you have a 5-card hand that is, 2 lands, Thoughtseize, a creature, and an aura, the hand's already much, much, much better than this hand, just because it has a creature in it. So the creatures make any of your hands, even if you're on 5 or 6 cards, sometimes even 4 cards, better than this hand. So my choice is mulligan. Hand number 2. You're playing Celestial Company, also in Historic. It's game 1, and you're on the play against an unknown opponent. And your hand is Scavenging Ooze, Kazana Mammoth, Forest, Plains, Branchloft Pathway, and Sun Petal Grove. Do you keep or do you mulligan? And my answer here is that this hand is also a mulligan, because it's just too slow and honestly too weak, right? You have the right number of creatures and lands, roughly, 3 creatures, 4 lands is acceptable. And you have a reasonable curve. You have a 2-drop and a 3-drop. You're already powering your Mammoth up into a 5/5. So you are doing things, but they're not the things that you have to do, right? This is a hate bears deck. You have to disrupt your opponent in some way, right? Because this clock is not going to be fast enough to beat anybody, right? You have to, if you were going to have a clock as low as this, you're going to have some disruption to go with it, right? You need the Archon of Emeria, you need the Elite Spellbinder, you need Thalia, you need Raiding, you need something. Or you need a faster clock than this, right? You need to go Lenore Elves into Lovestruck Beast and start attacking. These are your 2 options when you play a deck like this. So this hand, even though it has a clock and it has a curve, it's very anemic and has, you don't have enough of a clock to make up for not having any disruption, and these are the 2 avenues that this deck can win. And if I knew I was playing a matchup where Scavenging Ooze is very good, I would keep this hand, because then Scavenging Ooze becomes your piece of disruption, right? But versus the average deck, I don't think that is going to be the case. Even if Ooze is good, it's not going to win the game by itself versus the average deck. So when facing an unknown opponent, I think this hand is a mulligan, but if I knew my opponent and I knew Scavenging Ooze was very good versus them, then I would keep this hand. Our third hand is you're playing Mono Red, you're on the play versus the mirror, so you're playing Mono Red versus Mono Red, and it's game 1, and this is in Standard. And your opening hand is Bonecrusher Giant, Embercleave, Faceless Haven, Casto Embereth, and 3 Snow-Covered Mountains. So would you keep or would you mulligan? And my answer is that even though I normally don't like keeping 5-land hands with Mono Red, right? I think, 5 lands is a lot of lands, then you should keep this hand because it has specifically Bonecrusher Giant versus specifically a deck that is very weak to Bonecrusher Giant. because your opponent's also playing mono red, so they're very, very likely to have something that you can hit on turn 2. You know, that it has Fireblade Charger, it has Fervent Champion, it has Rimrock Knight, and it has Robber of the Reach. So it's pretty unlikely that you're not going to have any targets on turn 2. So the Bonecrusher Giant acts as your 2-drop and your 3-drop at the same time. So even though it's a 5-land hand, it's kind of a 3-spell hand as well, because the Bonecrusher Giant is so good. It's, you know, it's doing a lot of heavy lifting there. If I was playing versus a deck where I knew Bonecrusher Giant wasn't going to be good, for example, Sultai Ultimatum, then I wouldn't keep the hand, because I need the Bonecrusher Giant to be 2 cards here, and if it's just 1, it's not going to be enough. Right? So I think the context of this hand, you know, the specific matchup that you're playing against, and the fact that it is Bonecrusher Giant and not any other card, make me keep a 5-lander. So with Embercleave, right, which is not a card that you want in specifically a land-heavy hand. Right, the Embercleave doesn't really do anything at this point, but again, because it's specifically Bonecrusher Giant, I think it's a keep. If you replace Bonecrusher Giant with any other card in the deck, I'm not going to keep. And our fourth and last simple hand is you're playing Rogues in Standard. It's game 1, and you're on the draw versus a random opponent. Your hand is Into the Story, Drown in the Loch, Heartless Act, Island, Swamp, Fable Passage, and Zagoth Triumph. Do you keep or do you mulligan? And my answer here is that I think you have to mulligan this hand because you just don't have an enabler. So you have strong cards. You have Into the Story and Drown in the Loch, right, which are very good cards in the Rogues deck. You really want these cards every game, but you don't have any ways of turning them on. So the best you can do right now is to just kill a creature and Drown in the Loch for 1, and that's it. Right, and even though there are a lot of cards in your deck that can kickstart this process, right, you have 15 or 16 cards that can mill your opponent, depending on the list you're playing. There's always the chance that something goes wrong and they don't live, they don't mill enough. And you could draw when Robber played, and then it could die, right? Or you could play Soaring Thought Thief, it could also die before you get to attack. Or you could draw the Thieves Guild Enforcer, you mill for 2, but it's not enough to turn on Into the Story anyway. So I think when you were playing Rogues, I'm not going to say you shouldn't keep any hand that doesn't have an enabler, because there are hands that I will keep that don't have enablers in specific matchups, but I think you can't keep a hand that needs enablers and doesn't have them. So keeping a hand with no cards that mill them can be fine, but keeping a hand with no cards that mill them and with an Into the Story and a Drown in the Loch that need you to mill them for them to work is not going to be good enough. So I would mulligan a hand like this versus a no-no opponent. So that's what I have for today. Thank you so much for watching, and special thank you to my biggest supporters, the gold patrons, Daniel Luz, Foxy, Fernando Vizeu, Geoffrey Whitehead, Jaime Gonzalez, Lawson, Mattia Giardini, TJ Webb, and Thomas Pocorni. I really appreciate the support, and I'll see you next week.